One of the things your buddy Z has been trying to impart on all you lovely, lovely listeners is that the history that we've been presented with throughout our education and the hallowed halls of academia, well, as we learn more and we acquire more information in this information age, we're finding out that that story of history, well, it's really not holding up to scrutiny in so many ways, in so many examples. So I'm going to give you one example today that's going to highlight how the history we've been told, especially the history of these Americas, is, well, probably something quite different than what it actually was. This video is called 9,000-Year-Old Stonehenge Found Under Lake Michigan.
What's up, everybody? I saw this photo and the header, the mysterious prehistoric underwater structure beneath Lake Michigan, and I was seriously waiting for the punchline. But it's not a joke. They really found this at the bottom of Lake Michigan. And I bet there were some heads spinning about how they're going to explain this one. So I'm going to read the article and we'll talk about it a bit. So this is up at the north end of Lake Michigan in this snake tongue looking bay here called Traverse Bay. That's about 11 miles wide at its widest point. And check this place.
All right, so as you saw by the image, that in quotes we can call a Stonehenge-like structure. You can call it a megalith if you want. It's not super huge, but apparently it expands over a mile long. So we'll in quotes call it a megalith. Obviously, it's man-made, as you can see in this small little, the small window I have up there. And that's not a natural formation, okay? So why do we have a Stonehenge-like formation underneath Lake Michigan? And this idea of Stonehenge, some people think Stonehenge is a fake, but the particular pattern of Stonehenge can be found all around the world, these Stonehenge-like formations that these ancient cultures seem to have built.
Then finally, about 40 feet beneath Lake Michigan, Dr. Holly discovers stones arranged in a long line over 1 mile in length. Now, there are multiple structures that were found, so I'm not sure if the one in the photo is the one that they're talking about here. They're not very clear about anything other than it's there. Then they say the stones have been dated to approximately 9,000 years ago, which is 4,000 years before Stonehenge and 2,000 years after the Ice Age. So they have to go with this 9,000-year story to make it fit into their timeline, and everything's always happening over millions of years. This is right along with Nabta Playa and the Spanish Stonehenge that came out of the water during a drought a while back, only this is 40 feet under Lake Michigan. And
so Nabta Playa, then the Spanish Stonehenge, and now we have this one under Lake Michigan. Just think of all these other formations that exist that will never be discovered, that just exist somewhere, either buried by mud or sediment or underwater. And not just this formation, there's great cities that are submerged all over the world, off the coast of Japan, in the Mediterranean. Great cities that now reside underwater or under earth.
Culture that had these huge mounds that they built, which natives say was built by giants. And then they double down and say should be clearly understood that this is not a megalithic site. Yes, but it was built by intelligent thinking human beings that did this for a reason. So then they changed the subject for a minute, and we'll get back over to here, but they say that John O'Shea, University of Michigan, had been working on a similar structure over in Lake Huron. Okay, so now you're telling me that there's man-made structures all over the Great Lakes, all right?
Man-made structures all over the Great Lakes. So it's not just a one-off.
Over in Lake Huron, they say the main feature, known as Drop 45 Lane, is the most complex hunting structure ever discovered beneath the Great Lakes to date. So now you're telling me that there are multiples of these structures, this one being more complex than the others. The structure can...
Here's the interesting part, because when you look at, let's say, conventional understanding, academia's version of the Great Lakes, they have a very particular story. Basically, they say that the Great Lakes are a series of large, interconnected freshwater lakes in the east central interior of North America that connect to the Atlantic Ocean via the St. Lawrence River. And there's 5 lakes, right? Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. When you look into the formation of the lakes, you get a very particular story. It said the Great Lakes are estimated to have been formed at the end of the last glacial period, the Wisconsin glaciation, which ended 10 to 12,000 years ago when the Laurentide ice sheet receded. The retreat of the ice sheet left behind a large amount of meltwater that filled up the basins that the glaciers had carved, thus creating the Great Lakes as they are today. Interesting. Okay, so you're telling me that somewhere around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, and this is what we always hear about 10,000 BC, the so-called Younger Dryas, etc., etc. We apparently have these receding glacial formations and then the meltwater forming the lakes. Well, that's interesting. It's a good story, but how does that story match up with this idea that they're now finding evidence of advanced civilization under the lakes, in the lake bed? How does that match up with your receding glacier story and your melting glacier water? Interesting. What I'm noticing is, again, as I said before, that the presentation of history that we're all educated on growing up, more and more is not holding up to scientific scrutiny. It's not holding up to obvious reality. Why are there multiple advanced cultures buried under water all over? Why are there advanced cultures buried under sediment all over? It brings to mind, if you remember, the Easter Island statues that we all were taught growing up, those iconic statues on Easter Island. Well, turns out those statues, if you unearth them, are most of the statues are actually buried. Why didn't they teach us that part? Why didn't they teach us that the statues are buried and there's whole bodies? It's not just the head. That was known. How come when I was in elementary school, they didn't tell me about all of these ziggurats and pyramids found in Central and South America that were mostly buried and were dug out, and many of them that they know exist but still haven't been dug out? Why do we have large pyramids and large, basically whole civilizations that are buried? So we have buried civilizations, we have deluged civilizations. What are they not telling us? The Bible gives us a flood story. Many cultures give us a flood story, but there seems to be more than that. Based off my understandings, we seem to be, as a race, we seem to undergo cyclical destruction events. And we can argue about the frequency, we can argue about the impact, the magnitude. But you start to see these things much more than a deluge 10,000 or 6,000 years ago. We see evidence of cataclysm during the biblical Exodus story of Moses. Now, history pins the time of Moses to, let's call it, about 1,400 years before the time of Christ. We see a story of great cataclysm. It was presented in the Bible as plagues. We're told the Red Sea was parted. Could that be literal? We're seeing here a presentation where the Great Lakes appeared to be inhabited, and then what I can just conjecture was a cataclysm that filled the lakes in with water. Was the parting of the Red Sea and the plague of Exodus a let's call it a reset event? Then let's look at what they're calling the worst year in history, 536 AD, or in the Common Era. We're told was basically the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of 800 years that they called the Dark Ages. What happened? Why would Rome fall so quickly? Why would all other empires fall so quickly? What kind of event could put humanity into such a state for almost a millennia? Then we're presented with the mid 1300s and the plague story, the Black Plague. Is it possible that the plague was something else? Why do we have these cyclical events that happen? Many modern scholars now, alternative scholars for sure, will even point to cataclysmic reset events as late as the 1800s and even the early 1900s, which to me strains credibility and credulity, but I'm not going to discount it outright. What is this history? What are they keeping from us? Why are they keeping it from us? And maybe even more importantly, even when faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary, why are so many people stubbornly sticking to their preconditioned, indoctrinated beliefs?
Official man-made structures 40 feet, even 100 feet under Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And I'm sure in 2 weeks on the internet, this will be an acoustic energy generation power station, because that's how the internet works. People can't just be happy with the fact that the Great Lakes are a lot newer than we've been told, and people used to live down here where it's underwater, which is a huge discovery. And
we'll finish it off with what he said there. The Great Lakes are a lot newer than we've been told. Evidenced, it's obvious.